Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and thank you so much for tuning into one of our talks today. We are a year-round talk series bringing you the best creative voices across film, television, and theater, and I'm so excited today to be joined by the fantastic Cathy Yan to talk all about her film Dead Pigs. And the first thing I was really interested in is the fact that before you made the feature, you actually put together a short film that was very much a proof of concept, which a lot of filmmakers often do or consider before making a feature as a calling card. Because of the way that you're constructing a short narrative out of a feature narrative, I was really fascinated in how you took the overarching story and found version of it that would really fit into and tell its own story, but also be really representative of the larger story and concept that you wanted to tell.
Absolutely. Short films are very difficult, I find, very challenging and sort of its own beast in a way, and something that I really had to figure out. And I'm not really sure I ever fully did while in film school, because that obviously is sort of the craft of film school, is making shorts. I was lucky in the sense that Dead Pigs is sort of a collection of short stories in a way. And even the way we ended up shooting it was like there's the candy, two weeks of candy, 2 weeks of long, and then we'll sort of overlap between the characters. And each character had very much their own, sort of narrative and short story that can be pulled quite easily out of the feature. And so I just picked Old Wong's story because it had the narrative with the dead pigs. It was directly related, and in the short, it ends. A spoiler, I guess, but it ends with him meeting his son at the cafe, and so it felt like a bite-sized chunk that still sort of told the story, but didn't try to just, I think shove the short film with too much plot, because that always gets tricky, right? When you're trying to tell too much story in a short film.
And in writing the script for the feature, you've talked about how it came very naturally. And the thing that was always there from the get-go was who these characters are and what motivated them. So with the fact that you had such a concrete concept of who these characters were and the types of decisions that they would make in situations, how did that really help you when you were then working on and developing a lot of the narrative structure and where the plot was going to go?
I always start with character. Well, I start with two things. I start with character and I start with certain imagery. For whatever reason, I had the image of Candy on a roof with a bulldozer quite early on. And I have no idea. I mean, that's how just creativity works, I guess, right? I have no idea where it came from. And I sort of oftentimes will have that kind of imagery, and I'll back my way into it in a weird way. Or figure out how to arrive there, and I try to trust my sort of creative instincts and gut as to like why that image appeared to me and why I was so fascinated by it. And but yeah, I typically start with that, and then I start with character and trying to just figure out what felt right for them, and try to get into their heads. Sometimes I'll even do like a Myers-Briggs personality test where I become that character, and I'll try to figure out what they are, because I find that very interesting to see not just who they are externally, but who they are internally, and figure out like how they would react to things, think about things, the way that they see the world, the way that they would solve problems or not solve problems. And that helps me, I think, figure out the right story to tell that is driven mostly by character and the way that they would react to something, as opposed to imposing a story upon the characters themselves.
That's so great that that was one of the images that came to you first, because when you think about the film, that's one of the images that really just sears in your mind when you're retelling it yourself. And I actually wanted to talk about filming those scenes with Candy on the rooftop, because, obviously you were filming under a lot of budgetary and time constraints, but that you actually took 3 days to film. You had a rain machine, and you also had two cameras so that you weren't asking the actors to kind of fake their responses to each other's performances. So obviously that was a lot more intricate involved. And I wanted to ask you about the reason why and the way in which it was so important for you to build out all of those elements and take that time in what was a very rushed production schedule.
Well, you absolutely did your research. Well done. Yeah, I mean, we knew it was going to be the big, important climactic sequence of the film. And so there was just a lot of sort of production and prep that went into that. We got very, very lucky in the sense that it actually did end up raining one of the days, and then there was another day that was beautiful and clear, which worked out perfectly for the singing at the end. And there were 2 days in which it was sort of cloudy, one of them which was raining. So it really worked in our favor. I really don't know what would have happened if it was like bright and sunny every day. Not sure how we would have pulled that off with what we had. But yeah, I mean, we knew it was important, so we invested in, you know, having those 2 cameras. We had a crane as well, so that we could get up there, because it was a very sort of shallow and small roof that Candy could actually stand on. And so we actually had her strapped to it so that it would be a little more safe for her. And there's no barrier or banister or anything like that. And so we couldn't really put a camera up there that would give us a nice close-up, in fact, frontal close-up, because there would be no place for the cameraman to stand. And so we actually had to, you know, think about that and think about working with the crane in order to get that shot. And then obviously once we had the crane, we would, you know, we try to take advantage of that as well. But it was like not a full crane. It was kind of like a crane with one seat for the cameraman to sit on, actually, which seemed very precarious and dangerous. But we just got very, very lucky with it. And we also got lucky because that whole sequence also required the cooperation, I should say, of our pigeons, which we actually, in fact, starting very early on during prep, had acquired some baby pigeons and actually had someone that was feeding them at the house every day, so that they would recognize the coop and the house as their home, in order to pull off that one shot when they fly around. And they wouldn't leave, but they would fly and come back to the house. And so that just took so much preparation. And I think it was the sequence that was the most nerve-wracking. But because of that, I think we were able to sort of prep for it and knew what we were up against.
I'm also so interested in that specific location, because you got so lucky in the fact that, you know, without being able to do it with VFX, that you actually found a location that not only looked like that, but also had that desolate demolition all around it. So when you go into those really huge wide shots, you're actually seeing the landscape of what the story is trying to tell. When you were writing the script, was it always kind of something at the back of your mind of like, how are we going to find this location? Because so much visually in terms of how you tell the story is riding on that.
Absolutely. Again, I mean, I actually started scouting for that location probably a few years before we even made the movie. I think when we were shooting the short, and I had worked with a producer then, Clarissa Zhang, who ended up producing Dead Pigs as well. And so I had a lot of the same team, and we just started scouting back then, because I knew that it was so important. And also I wanted to capture a moment in time that I think has passed in China a little bit, where there was just all this change, and now everything that has sort of been demolished has been demolished already. But there was this moment in time where it was really like the cities were just expanding and expanding and expanding, and all of these old villages were just getting demolished. I mean, this village that we ended up shooting in, it was called Sunling Village, and it was the size of, I mean, it was a substantial village. It was, you know, 20 city blocks by 20 city blocks, and all of it ended up getting demolished. And when I would go and visit it, and we found it pretty early on, initially when we visited, it had a lot more homes. And then over the course of, you know, basically the time that it took to get financing for the film, more and more of it got demolished. And eventually, by the time we were actually looking for Candy's house, most of the homes were already gone. So it actually, in a weird way, worked out in our favor, but it was also very sad and very emotional and quite depressing to be there, because you would find toys and sort of homeware and clothing that were just left behind. And it felt kind of like a battleground in a way. And even Candy's house had been abandoned. And so we sort of resurrected it from the dead for the film.
Yeah. And one of the things that I think you're so superb at as a filmmaker is taking these really character-driven, intimate stories, but also using it to create a narrative that tells a larger landscape. And particularly with this film, you know, that idea of modernization and the human cost that comes with it, and the way that it really impacts and influences relationships. When you're crafting out a lot of the details for a film like this, are you thinking about, you know, as you're crafting the character's narrative journey, are you really thinking constantly at the back of your mind about what's the bigger picture, what's the larger story that I'm trying to tell through these intimate moments?
That's a great question. I don't know. I think for me, a lot of it comes from that, my initial interest in telling that story, or, setting it in that background comes from that journalistic instinct of like, what is the bigger idea? Why is this relevant? What does this say about us as humans, and the society that we are currently in? That just tends to be what inspires me, and helps me zone in on what are the stories that I want to tell as a filmmaker. So I think um, because that's where I start with, it's kind of always omnipresent and always kind of hanging over it. And then I try to forget it, because I think then you need to kind of zero in on the human story of it, and just tell that specific story, and try to tell that well. Because if you're trying to do, serve both of these masters, I think you can kind of end up somewhere in the middle, or it feels too much like a documentary, or the ideas kind of overrun just the human story behind it. And so it's always a tricky balance. I start there and then I go small, as opposed to trying to, serve both of them, I think.
Yeah. And similarly, when you look at both of your features, there's always that element of a slight heightened reality. But again, it always feels completely grounded through the characters and the emotional journey that they're going on. And particularly for a story like this, it's really difficult to balance what that tone is and how far you can push it before it feels like too much and doesn't feel like it's part of the film. Was there any sort of journey in the script writing and the filming process in really finding that, or did it just come very naturally to you in the process?
Oh, it was such a journey. I think you only really figure out the tone once you're on set, and then again in the edit, because with filmmaking, you're not doing this alone. You have all your collaborators, and every element of your toolkit in a way, or every tool that you have, whether it's the actors or production design or cinematography, music, all of that is going to, slightly adjust the tone and the entire vision of the film. And so I think you're just still constantly figuring it out. I mean, I remember my short film being quite serious. There is that sort of, I came out of NYU, and I think there is that NYU aesthetic, or that indie aesthetic of the handheld, and, like telling these sort of impoverished stories even, and being a little more straightforward and earnest in that way. And it just didn't work for me. I realized that I was like, this is just not a style that feels natural to me, and frankly it's just been done to death. And so I think from that point, that was a big learning experience, of like, well, what is my style, or what is the tone, or what is the tone that speaks to me. And so much of it just came out of China. I mean, it is a very absurd place, and it certainly was in that moment that I was trying to capture in the film. I mean, it was just so ambitious and broad, but also like weird and incredibly kitschy. And I love anything that is kitschy and sort of extravagant like that. And so I just try to capture these little details, and then more and more of that just came to us while we were prepping, while we were shooting. Candies, like the beauty salon women that chance, that we found when we were location scouting. We found the salon, and then they just happened to, I had heard about these sort of exercises in China, whether it's school children or employees. Oftentimes they'll have these sort of like morning chants and exercises. So I'd heard about it, and I just asked them whether there was something that they did, and they showed me what they did. And it was so incredible. And so obviously we just shot it. So there was almost this documentary element to it, where I just pointed my camera, frankly, at some of these things that I found to be amusing or interesting or absurd or ridiculous, and try to capture that. And so the tone came out of that. And then again, it came out of working with the actors and finding these really funny moments, or just finding these emotional moments, and finding really interesting unscripted moments throughout the course of the shoot. And that's what I always find very invigorating, is being able to do that your script is not at all set in stone, but in fact is meant to just be a mere blueprint for the film itself.
And then there's also that wonderful moment towards the end of the film where you kind of break the fourth wall and have all of the characters break into song together. And it's such a great cumulative moment of emotion and who these characters are and the journey that they've been through up to this point. But I was interested in actually how you really had to start thinking about that several scenes before in the movie, because otherwise it would have taken us out of the film. But it actually, it flows into it completely naturally. It feels like, of course, this is what's happening in the movie right now. So how did you really work in the scenes leading up to that moment to start kind of laying the groundwork so that when it happens, it feels like a natural transition for the audience?
Great question. Yeah, it was a really big challenge because I had written the song into the script very early on in the first draft, and I don't know why, it just felt right. And I think it's about creating that slightly heightened world where,
Mhm.
for example, the colors were just slightly more saturated, slightly more exaggerated.
Mhm.
People, the performances, everything was just ever so slightly dialed up by design, and the way that we shot it, which was very sort of um, epic and specific, as opposed to like a handheld verite style. So all of these little choices, and then on top of that, I wanted so the song is deeply popular in China. Like everyone knows this song. It's like a beloved song, and it was a song that's very personal to me in my childhood. But for Westerners, like a lot of people have never heard the song, and so that was very deliberate. We actually ended up putting the song, or versions of the song, like there's a remix version of the song that plays in the fashion show that Sean's walking in. There's another very like kitschy, ridiculous cover of the song that plays when Jen and Shasha had their first date. Wong sings the song at the very beginning of the movie, and so that was also very deliberate to sort of seed in versions of the song. So by the end, hopefully the hope was that even if you didn't necessarily know the song or recognize the song, it kind of just was in the back of your mind somewhere, so that when it did come, it felt a little bit more natural and inevitable as well. And then it was about, again, just trying to figure out the right tone. So we establish a more heightened world. We introduced the song earlier. And a lot of it, what clicked in, I think, for me, was figuring out the karaoke of it all, and that having something so self-aware, because we were trying to figure out with subtitles, like, okay, well, what do we do here? Do we try to subtitle it? Do we translate it? Do we not? Do we need subtitles at all? And that was not written in the film initially, what we were going to do with the subtitles. And then we were in the edit, and I was like, you know what? Let's make it karaoke titles. And that, I think, really pushed it over the edge of like, we are now self-aware. This is absolutely breaking the fourth wall. And it's okay to, it kind of gave the audience, I think, the little bit of a wink, or the okay for them to just enjoy this ride and understand that this is all self-aware and this is part of the tone of the film. And so all of those little things, I think, worked in tandem to try to hopefully make it work, as you said.
Yeah. And with that idea of translation and language throughout the film, you originally wrote the script in English before translating it to Chinese, but then there's the further dialect that's very specific, Shanghainese, which
Mhm.
you then kind of entrusted the actors to really kind of lead the path on. And you've mentioned how that made you feel less precious about the specific wording of what things were. And so I just wanted to ask a little bit about the journey and the way in which you worked with the actors on really just focusing on the emotional intent of the scenes as a result of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was something I really honed during Red Pigs too. So much of, there's so much you learn in film school and just in filmmaking. And I think for me, what was very, very helpful was actually I ended up taking acting classes, not to act, but just to sort of observe outside of film school within the sort of, New York acting world and theater world. And that was really deeply informative for me because it made me better understand actors. And what I realized, or certainly the way that I like to work, is really much more collaborative and much more in the moment, and trying to just get these very interesting instinctual performances out of the actors. And so for me, when they're caught up here in their heads thinking about what their next line is, like, it's always going to be not as interesting as if they're just reacting in the moment. So what I often told the actors was like, forget, like, this is what the scene is about, this is the context in which your character is here, now just react to what the other actor is giving you. So oftentimes if there's a close-up or we're only on one actor, then I would actually tell the other actor some secret direction, and then tell the actor that the camera's actually on to just react to that and kind of keep them on their toes, so that they're never, they don't really ever settle into a certain cadence or a certain take of the scene. That's just kind of how I like to work. And it's really fun because you end up with millions and thousands, so many different types of takes, as opposed to the perfect take. Because I think if I just try to get everyone to work together so that it gets to be the perfect take that is somehow in my mind, and if I don't get it, like, one, that's so deeply disappointing, but also two, why would I think that that's the perfect take for the movie? I don't know what is the perfect take. And so I'm always just trying to explore and play and find find different takes, find interesting moments, and you'll feel it in the moment. I think the actors do, everyone does, and it's this wonderful dance and the camera and everything else. So I don't really like to get much coverage either because I don't like forcing the actors to just match whatever they've done previously. I don't find that interesting, and I don't think that's giving them, you know, the opportunity to really explore the scene and the characters.
Within that freedom as well, you also tend to not specifically block a lot of the scenes out in advance as well, to give them that freedom of motion. And again, kind of freeing up their mind to not have to think, okay, I need to be standing over here by the time I reach that line. But it
Yeah.
also says a lot about your visual style as a filmmaker as well, in that, you really think about the motion and the choreography of the camera. Was that always the intent when, even when you first started writing the script and thinking about the visual elements of the film, that you knew you wanted to have that fluidity and motion throughout?
I've always loved that. I think that, you know, it's an innovation that can happen partially because cameras are lighter and we can shoot digitally, and it's sort of like, why are we so burdened by not, you know, by staticness, if we don't need to. And I think on top of that, I used to be a dancer and a choreographer, so movement is deeply interesting to me, and how the camera moves, and thinking of the camera almost like as a separate dancer, you know. And again, it keeps everyone on their toes. It keeps our crew members on their toes too. It keeps the camera operator, it keeps, you know, the boom operator, it keeps our it keeps, you know, the grip, like everyone on their toes, because if every take is just ever so slightly different, then they also have to, you know, react in real time to the way that the actors are moving. And oftentimes you find these beautiful frames by just kind of allowing that to happen. And so, yeah, I like keeping everyone on their toes, I guess, but that's because I like to be kept on my toes, and I like to feel like I'm getting surprised, and the next take can be even more interesting than the previous one, or it could bomb and not work, but that's okay. Then we just do another one, you know. And I so I try to embrace the freedoms that we are allowed to have, because one, we shot on digital, partially because we couldn't afford film, and two, you know, cameras are lighter and easier now, and so let's move that camera around. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the other visual aesthetics that I love in the way that you always approach it is the idea of color and costume. And, when you look at Harley, it's not just, okay, this is the outfit that she's wearing. It's like, okay, she's going to have a shirt, she's going to have suspenders, there's going to be this next layer, then there's going to be the jacket. So there's so much minutia and detail that goes into it. And with this film, when you look at, it's not just that this is what Candy's wearing and this is the color palette, then she's got rollers in her hair. And so I just wanted to talk about the way in which you always think about the minutia and the detail, and not just even a singular outfit when you're crafting out the looks for your characters.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, partially, I just love fashion, and I love costumes. I think that, like, I think for a lot of actors, actually, they don't really feel like they're the character until they're in that makeup and in the costumes, and it's so transformative and so important to them. And so working and collaborating with them pretty early on in terms of what the character is going to look and feel like is deeply important. And part of that is all the layers. I think that, like, the sort of monochromatic uniform, I mean, that might work for certain characters, but I was just lucky that I had a lot of characters with a lot of layers. And Candy, I think, yeah, like I think it's the way that we wear things too, right? It's like you want to think about what your socks are, you want to think about, like, I'm trying to be more cognizant of putting together outfits, as opposed to just like, well, these are comfortable pants, and I guess I like that sweater enough. But thinking of how it works cohesively. And I think that I had two characters, Harley Quinn and Candy, that both had that style, in a way that's sort of like they can kind of make anything work, and they throw everything on, and it's very layered and eccentric, and very unique to their own personalities as well. And specifically for Birds of Prey, so much of the movie actually happens over the course of a day, that it was also a place to start of like, well, how can we give them essentially costume changes without costume changes? And it also added, I think, to the reality of it, because you don't see a lot of superheroes or comic book characters wearing anything remotely even wearable, really. And it was nice to be like, you know what, like, as a woman, I would wear a jacket, and then I might get hot, and so I'm going to take that off, but then I'll have another shirt underneath, and I can always take that shirt off, and and have those multiple layers. I think it just feels more realistic, and it grounds the character in something too.
Yeah. And one of the things with making Dead Pigs is when you make your first feature, there's so many things that you're learning on the job, but also it forces you to work in this very instinctive way and just really kind of feeling out how you're going to approach certain things and make certain choices. And I imagine that there's this element where that's never going to fully exist again in any other project that you work on. And so I actually wanted to ask, what do you feel are the elements that you got to experience in making this movie that you feel like were so unique and really just existed in the world of Dead Pigs for you as a filmmaker?
Hmm. It's so magical, I think, your first feature, and I certainly felt that way. I mean, it was just such a wonderful experience and so pure in the sense that I was able to basically do what I want. I mean, the budget was so small that none of our, our financiers just didn't even bother really, which was great. We had to keep our own budget and everything like that, but like no one bothered to, check up on us, and no one bothered in the edit. None of that, which is so lovely. And then on top of that, I think, when there isn't much of a budget too, everyone that you are collaborating with are really in it for the right reasons. And you do have to just go with your instincts. And especially as a writer director on that film, and something so deeply personal to me. And it felt like a story that really only I could tell. I think it just bought me a lot of support, in the sense that there weren't that many chefs in the kitchen. There weren't that many voices to say, well, actually, let's do it this way or that way. It really did feel very collaborative, but at the same time, like holistically, my vision, because there was no other vision to sort of counter it. And I think because of that, it really is. I think for a lot of filmmakers, I would imagine like that first feature just feels so good in that way. Like I remember asking another director about his first feature, which I really loved, and he was like, "Yeah," and I was like, "What was it? What was the like what made it so good, I guess, or what was so special about it?" And he's like, "The fact I didn't know what I was doing." And I somewhat agree with that. I think that when you don't have all these voices in your head, or you don't think I have to get that, I can take this risk because no one's forcing me to not take this risk, then then you get to be exactly who you want to be, as a writer and as a director. And then it starts to just change things when there's a little more pressure, or more voices that you have to hear out.
Yeah. Well, I'm so excited that more audiences are getting the opportunity to discover it with it being released on movie. Thank you so much, Cathy.
Thank you so much. It was lovely chatting with you.